Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Guangxu Emperor and the mystery that lay dormant for a century within the high, red walls of the Forbidden City. It is a story of a throne that felt more like a cage, of a man whose breath was as fragile as the empire he was born to lead, and of a cold November evening that changed the course of history forever. Imagine, if you will, the city of Beijing in the year 1908. The air is sharp, carrying the first crystalline bite of winter. The sun has long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the vast complex of palaces and courtyards to be swallowed by an indigo twilight. Here, in the heart of the capital, the world feels incredibly old and remarkably still. We find ourselves at the Palace of Cherishing Purity. This is not the grand, bustling heart of a thriving court, but a place of heavy, suffocating silence. The walls here are thick, painted a deep, weathered vermilion that seems to absorb the meager light of the lanterns. Outside, the wind moans through the gaps in the yellow-tiled roofs, a sound like a distant choir of ghosts. Inside, the atmosphere is thick with the scent of burning sandalwood and the faint, metallic tang of old charcoal heaters. Every footfall on the polished stone floors echoes, a reminder of how empty these halls have become. The emperor has lived here in a state of quiet, agonizing isolation for 10 years, a prisoner within his own birthright, watching the world move on without him from behind the ornamental lattice of his windows. He sits by a window overlooking the dark waters of the lake that surrounds the Yingtai Pavilion. In the darkness, the water looks like black ink, reflecting nothing but the cold, indifferent stars. For the emperor, who is only 37 years old, this island has been his entire universe. He spent his days surrounded by ancient clocks and watches, their rhythmic ticking the only heartbeat in a room filled with the dust of forgotten reforms. He was a man of modern visions, a man who wanted to pull his nation into a new era, but those dreams were severed a decade ago. Now, on this night of the 14th of November, his body feels as heavy as the silken robes that drape over his thin frame. There is a weariness in his bones that sleep cannot reach, a deep, pervasive fatigue that seems to seep from the very stones of the palace itself. As the hours of the evening stretch thin, a change begins to settle over the room. The emperor's breathing, usually shallow and quiet, becomes labored. He feels a sudden, sharp heat blooming in his abdomen, a fire that no amount of tea or medicine can quench. He looks down at his hands, and in the dim amber glow of the lamps, they seem to tremble with a strange, electric tingling. He tries to call out, but his voice is caught in a throat that feels constricted, as if the very air has turned to liquid. His attendants, moving like shadows in the periphery, begin to notice the deepening hue of his face. It is not the flush of a fever, but a darkening, a bruised, shadowy blue that creeps across his features, masking the youthful lines of a man who should have had decades left to rule. The physical pain is accompanied by a profound sense of loneliness. In these final moments, the grand titles of the Qing Dynasty offer no comfort. He is simply a man of 37 years, trapped in a palace that has become his tomb. The physician is summoned, his footsteps hurried and frantic against the quiet of the night. But the distance between the emperor's bedside and the help he needs feels like an ocean. Reports would later speak of violent stomach aches and a sudden, inexplicable collapse. But in the room, there is only the sound of a struggle for air. The incense smoke curls lazily toward the ceiling, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding beneath it. The emperor's eyes, once bright with the fire of the 100 Days' reform, begin to lose their focus, drifting toward the shadows of the ornate rafters above. Finally, the struggle ceases. The fragile breath that had sustained the Guangxu Emperor through years of house arrest and political exile simply stops. It is a quiet departure, a flicker of a candle finally meeting the edge of the wax. The Palace of Cherishing Purity falls into a silence so absolute it feels physical. The clocks he loved so dearly continue to tick, marking the seconds of a new era that he will never see. He is gone at 37, leaving behind an empire on the brink of collapse and a mystery that would remain buried for exactly 100 years. Outside, the wind continues its mournful song over the Black Lake, and in the distance, the Forbidden City remains a fortress of secrets, guarding the truth of what really happened on this cold November night in 1908. To understand the cold, calculated end of the Guangxu Emperor, we must travel back 10 years before the arsenic reached his lips. We must go to the humid summer of 1898, a time when the air inside the Forbidden City was heavy with the scent of old wood, blooming lotus, and the electric tension of a world on the brink of collapse. For over a century, the great Qing Empire had been stumbling, bruised by foreign wars and internal decay. The young emperor, then in his late 20s, looked out from behind the high vermilion walls and saw a nation fading into a shadow of its former glory. He was a man of fragile health but fierce intellectual hunger, and in that sweltering June, he decided to reach for the light. He imagined a China reborn, modernized, and strong enough to stand against the Western powers that were slowly carving up its shores like a ripe fruit. This period of desperate ambition would later be called the 100 Days of Reform, though in truth it lasted for only 103. Imagine the emperor in the hall of mental cultivation, surrounded by stacks of paper that reached toward the ceiling. He had found kindred spirits in brilliant scholars like Kang Yaowei and Liang Qichao. Together, they worked with a frantic energy, as if they knew their window of opportunity was narrowing with every setting sun. The scratching of bamboo brushes against silk paper was the only sound in the deep of night as edict after edict was drafted. They planned to revolutionize the education system, to build the Imperial University of Peking, and to abolish the ancient, rigid civil service examinations known as the eight-legged essays. They wanted a constitutional monarchy, a government that breathed and adapted. For those 103 days, the emperor felt, for the first time, like he was truly holding the reins of his own destiny. But every brushstroke of reform felt like a personal insult to his aunt, the Empress Dowager Cixi. While the emperor resided in the heart of Beijing, Cixi watched from her sprawling summer palace, a place of tranquil lakes and deceptive calm. To her, these changes were not progress. They were a betrayal of the ancestors and a dangerous surrender to foreign ways. She saw her nephew, whom she had raised and manipulated since he was 4 years old, finally showing his teeth. The rift between them was not merely political. It was a fundamental clash of souls. Cixi believed in the absolute, unchanging authority of the throne, while Guangxu believed the throne must change to survive. As the emperor pushed harder, removing conservative officials and streamlining the bureaucracy, the silence from the summer palace grew louder. It was the silence of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The atmosphere in the capital became suffocating. Rumors swirled through the tea houses and the narrow alleys of the city. There were whispers of a plot to arrest the Empress Dowager, a secret plan involving a rising military star named Yuan Shikai. The emperor knew that as long as his aunt held the loyalty of the army, his reforms were written on water. He reached out to Yuan, hoping to secure his protection. But loyalty in the Forbidden City is a liquid thing, easily poured from one vessel to another. Yuan Shikai did not protect the emperor. He chose the side of the matriarch. On the morning of September 21st, the hope of the reform movement shattered. Cixi returned to the Forbidden City with a retinue of iron-willed guards. She did not need an army to reclaim her power. She needed only her presence and the weight of her shadow. The crackdown was swift and merciless. The emperor was seized and taken to the Ocean Terrace, a small, isolated palace on a man-made island within the imperial grounds. It was a beautiful prison, surrounded by shimmering water that served as a moat. He was stripped of his power, though he kept his title, becoming a ghost who still wore the imperial yellow. While he sat in his golden cage, the men who had inspired him were hunted down. 6 of the most prominent reformers, known to history as the Six Gentlemen, were arrested. Among them was Tan Sidong, a man of such conviction that he refused to flee, stating that no reform had ever succeeded without the shedding of blood. At the Keishiku execution grounds, beneath a gray sky, they were beheaded. The dreams of a modern China were buried in the dirt that day, and the emperor could only listen to the distant echoes of the blades from his island of exile. This was the true beginning of the end. For the next 10 years, the Guangxu Emperor would live in a state of suspended animation, a prisoner of the woman who had once called herself his mother. The resentment Cixi felt was no longer just about politics. It was a deep, poisonous grudge born of his attempt to displace her. She had won the coup, but she knew that as long as he lived, he remained a symbol of resistance. She watched him age in his confinement, his health failing, his spirit broken. Every day he spent on that island was a reminder of his defiance. As we look back at those 100 days of hope, we see the motive for the crime that was yet to come. Cixi could not allow him to outlive her. She could not allow him to have the final word on the future of China. The poison that would eventually end his life was not just a chemical. It was the final chapter of a decade-long revenge. Imagine a place surrounded by the still, dark waters of the South Lake, just a short distance from the bustling heart of the Forbidden City, yet feeling as though it were 1,000 miles away. This is Yingtai, the ocean terrace. It is a small, ornate island, a jewel of the imperial gardens, but for the Guangxu Emperor, it became a world that began and ended at the water's edge. Following the sudden collapse of his dreams for reform in 1898, the stone bridge that connected this island to the mainland was no longer a path of statecraft, but a guarded threshold. Every evening, the bridge was effectively sealed, and the emperor was left in a silence so profound it felt heavy. The island was beautiful, filled with ancient pavilions and weeping willows that dipped their branches into the lake, but to Zacian, it was the setting of a 10-year winter that would never truly thaw. Inside the Hanyuan Hall, the emperor's primary residence during his confinement, the air was often thick with the scent of damp wood and the lingering smoke of incense. The grandeur of the Qing Dynasty was still visible in the intricate carvings of the rafters and the silk hangings, but the vibrancy had faded. The rooms were cold, especially during the long Beijing winters when the lake would freeze into a solid sheet of gray ice. He lived a life of suspended animation. While the world outside was changing with terrifying speed, the turn of the century bringing new wars and shifting alliances, the emperor remained trapped in a perpetual yesterday. He was the son of heaven, yet he was forbidden from touching the earth of his own empire beyond these few acres of rock and timber. The psychological weight of this isolation was a slow poison in itself, a quiet erosion of the spirit that mirrored the physical dampness of his surroundings. To pass the hours that stretched into years, the emperor turned to the delicate world of mechanics. He had always been fascinated by the craftsmanship of the West, and now, in his solitude, he became obsessed with watches and clocks. It is said that the Hanyuan Hall was filled with the sound of 100 ticking hearts. He would spend entire days hunched over a workbench, his slender fingers meticulously taking apart tiny brass gears and springs, cleaning them, and putting them back together again. Perhaps there was a comfort in a world where everything followed a logical order, where a broken mechanism could be mended with enough patience. He also spent his time reading foreign books and even attempted to learn English from the Western-educated ladies of the court. These were his windows to a world. He was no longer allowed to lead small rebellions of the mind against a body that was essentially a political ghost. But even his silence was not private. He was surrounded by eunuchs, many of whom were spies personally chosen by the Empress Dowager Cixi. They watched his every move, reporting his moods and his health back to the summer palace. Occasionally, the gates would open, and he would be brought out to perform the empty rites of his office. He would sit on a low stool to the left of the main throne, a position of deliberate humiliation, while Cixi sat high above him, making the decisions that shaped the lives of 400 million people. He was required to kneel before her, to listen to her reprimands, and to act as a silent prop in the theater of her power. The officials who once looked to him for a new era now looked past him, seeing only a man who had been defeated. This public stripping of his dignity was perhaps more painful than the loneliness of the island itself. As the years moved toward 1908, the toll on his health became impossible to ignore. Rumors began to drift through the palace corridors like a cold draft. Some said the emperor was suffering from chronic kidney disease, a lingering ailment that left him pale and exhausted. Others whispered that his spirit was simply breaking under the strain of a decade of imprisonment. He complained of violent stomach pains and a strange tingling in his hands, symptoms that his physicians recorded with clinical detachment. His face, once bright with the fire of the reform movement, began to take on a sallow, sickly cast. The Empress Dowager, too, was aging, and the court began to realize a terrifying truth. If the emperor outlived his jailer, he might reclaim the throne and seek vengeance on those who had betrayed him. The tension on the island of Yingtai grew thick as the final year of his life approached, and the shadows of the ocean terrace grew longer and darker than ever before. The archives of the Forbidden City are a place of heavy, velvet silence, where the air is thick with the scent of old paper and the lingering residue of ancient incense. Within these walls, tucked away from the prying eyes of the court, lie the medical scrolls from the final months of the emperor's life. To look upon them is to see a record of a body in transition, though the hand that wrote these characters knew far more than it ever dared to voice. These scrolls, written in the late autumn of 1908, tell two stories at once. There is the official story, dictated by the expectations of the Empress Dowager and the stability of the dynasty. And then, there is the story hidden between the lines, captured in the observations of a man named Gigan, one of the few physicians permitted to witness the emperor's final, agonizing hours. As we enter the month of November in 1908, the atmosphere within the ocean terrace, the emperor's island prison, becomes suffocating. The physician arrives, his footsteps echoing softly on the stone paths that lead to the Hanyuan temple. He carries with him the tools of his trade, but his internal records reveal a truth that contradicts the imperial bulletins. In his private notes, the physician describes a scene that is far from a peaceful decline. He writes of an emperor who is no longer the quiet, scholarly figure he once was. Instead, he finds a man of 37 years gripped by a sudden and inexplicable violence of the body. The scrolls record spells of stomach pain, so severe that the emperor is seen rolling across his bed, his cries echoing through the drafty, ornate halls of his gilded cage. The physical descriptions in these medical records are jarring when contrasted with the official narrative of a slow, natural passing. Gigan observes a peculiar and terrifying change in the emperor's appearance. He notes that the emperor's face, usually pale and composed, has begun to turn a deep, unsettling shade of blue. In other passages, it is described as a darkening, a shadow that seems to rise from within and settle beneath the skin of his cheeks and forehead. This discoloration, this sudden transformation of the features, is a hallmark of something far more sinister than a simple failure of the organs. It is the visible signature of a toxin, a silent intruder that has begun to shut down the emperor's breath and his heart. Imagine the physician's hand trembling as he dipped his brush into the ink, documenting a transformation that looked less like sickness and more like an assault. Along with the blue tint of the face, the scrolls mention a persistent tingling in the emperor's hands and feet. This sensation, described as if 1,000 needle pricks were dancing across his skin, speaks to a nervous system under extreme duress. The physician records these symptoms with a clinical precision that feels almost like a confession. He writes of the emperor's teeth being clenched tight, his eyes rolling upward in his head as the spasms take hold of his frame. These are not the symptoms of the chronic illness the court claimed he suffered from. They are the hallmarks of a massive, sudden influx of poison. Yet, even as he witnesses these horrors, the physician must continue to prescribe traditional remedies, brews intended to strengthen the blood or calm the spirit, knowing full well that no tea or herb can counteract the white powder that has already done its work. The official medical records, the ones meant for the eyes of history, tell a different tale. They speak of a gradual weakening, of a heart and lungs that are simply tired of the long struggle. They use flowery, poetic language to describe the fading of the imperial spark. But the physician's scroll, the one that contains the raw observations of those final 3 days, is a document of immense tension. One can almost feel the weight of the silence in the room, as the emperor screamed that his stomach felt as if it were being consumed by fire, a fire that no amount of cooling water could extinguish. The physician was caught in a trap of loyalty and fear, watching a murder unfold while being forced to treat it as a natural tragedy. There is a profound loneliness in the way these records describe the emperor's final hours on the 14th of November. Surrounded by eunuchs and under the distant, watchful eye of the Empress Dowager, he was a man alone with his pain. The records tell us that the head eunuch, Li Lianying, was seen coming and going, delivering items to the emperor's table. Speculation persists that a bowl of yogurt was the final vessel for his end. The physician's notes capture the aftermath of that meal. The sudden collapse, the frantic scramble to find a pulse, and the final, heavy silence that descended upon the ocean terrace. The ink on the scroll is dry now, but the truth it holds remains as sharp and biting as it was over a century ago. In the decades that followed, these medical records were scrutinized and debated, hidden and revealed. It would take nearly 100 years for modern science to confirm what the physician's brush had hinted at in 1908. When the emperor's remains were finally examined in 2008, the arsenic levels found in his hair were over 2,000 times the normal limit. The poison was concentrated at the roots, proving that it had been administered in one fatal, overwhelming dose. The physician's scroll was not merely a record of illness. It was a witness statement, a silent scream for justice written in the ebony ink of a man who saw the light go out in the eyes of an emperor. As we look closer at these records, the shadows of the Forbidden City seem to lengthen, and the true nature of the crime begins to emerge from the darkness. The air inside the Forbidden City in November of 1908 carried a chill that seemed to penetrate even the thickest silk tapestries. It was a cold that did not just cling to the skin, but settled deep within the ancient stone walls of the Hall of Cultivating Mind. The emperor was gone. His breath had ceased on the 14th day of the month, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt as though the very heart of the empire had stopped beating. But the shadows did not remain still for long. As the yellow lanterns flickered in the drafty corridors, a new tension began to coil through the courtyards. The morning had barely begun, the ritual wailing of the eunuchs still a raw, rhythmic sound in the night air, when the focus of the palace shifted abruptly from the dead sovereign to the dying matriarch. Less than 24 hours had passed since the Guangxu Emperor's final, agonizing moments. In the Hall of Joyful Longevity, the Empress Dowager Cixi, the woman who had held the reins of China for nearly half a century, was fading. To the officials and attendants, it felt as though the sun had set twice in a single day, a double sunset that threatened to plunge the world into total darkness. The timing was more than merely coincidental. It was theatrical, almost impossible to believe. How could the young, 37-year-old emperor perish just one day before his 72-year-old aunt and captor? The synchronicity of their departures suggested a dark, invisible hand guiding the transition of power. A final act of control from a woman who refused to let the future exist without her influence. Inside the Empress Dowager's chambers, the atmosphere was a thick, suffocating blend of medicinal herbs, burning sandalwood, and the underlying metallic scent of slow decay. Cixi sat propped against golden pillows, her face a mask of iron while even as her body failed her. Outside her doors, the frantic energy of the court reached a fever pitch. Grand counselors whispered in hushed, urgent tones, their boots clicking softly against the polished floors as they moved between the dying woman's bedside and the rooms where the fate of the Qing Dynasty was being decided. There was no time for the customary, slow period of grieving. The vacuum of power was an abyss, and into that abyss, they were preparing to thrust a 3-year-old child named Puyi. The contrast was startling. The weight of thousands of years of imperial history resting on the small, trembling shoulders of a toddler. Rumors began to spread through the palace like wood smoke in a winter breeze. They traveled from the lowliest kitchen servants to the highest-ranking eunuchs, carried in stolen glances and half-spoken sentences. It was said that Cixi, knowing her own end was near, could not endure the thought of the Guangxu Emperor outliving her. She feared that once she was gone, he would reclaim his throne, reverse her policies, and perhaps even seek vengeance for his decade of imprisonment. The whispers suggested a final, lethal order, a gift of poisoned yogurt or a bowl of tainted soup delivered to the emperor's lonely pavilion. The physical evidence was hidden behind layers of ritual and secrecy, but the court felt the truth in the air. The emperor had not just died. He had been removed to clear the path for the Empress Dowager's final, calculated arrangements. The texture of the palace during these hours was one of white silk and gray ash. White was the color of death, and suddenly, the vibrant reds and golds of the Forbidden City were being veiled in ivory cloth. Thousands of yards of silk were draped over doorways and wrapped around the waists of mourning officials. The sound of rhythmic chanting from the lamas and monks created a low, vibrating hum that echoed through the marble courtyards, a sound designed to guide the souls of the departed to the beyond. But there was no peace in the sound. It was a restless, anxious vibration. The torches cast long, dancing shadows against the dragon-carved pillars, making the stone creatures appear as though they were writhing in the gloom, sensing the collapse of the world they were built to protect. While some looked toward the Empress Dowager, others cast suspicious glances at the powerful General Yuan Shikai or the chief eunuch Li Lianying. Everyone had a motive. Everyone stood to lose or gain everything in the shifting tides of the new regency. The frantic nature of the transition meant that records were incomplete, and the doctors who had attended the emperor were suddenly silent, their eyes downcast when questioned by the high officials. The medicine bottles were cleared away with uncharacteristic speed, the linens replaced, and the body of the Guangxu Emperor was prepared for burial with a haste that felt like a cover-up. In the chaos of the double sunset, the truth was being buried under the weight of tradition and the immediate, desperate necessity of crowning a new, infant king. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, this moment in 1908 would be remembered as the beginning of the end. The two deaths, so close they were almost one, signaled the total exhaustion of a dynasty. The emperor's pavilion, once a place of quiet scholarly pursuit and later a gilded cage, now stood empty, haunted by the lingering question of his final hours. The scent of the arsenic, if it had been there, was masked by the heavy perfumes of the court. The palace settled into a deep, uneasy slumber, the two coffins awaiting their final journey, while the world outside began to wake to the news of an empire that had lost its head and its heart in a single, suspicious day. The mystery remained, locked behind the high crimson walls, waiting for a future that could finally speak its name. The winter of 1908 arrived early in the Forbidden City, bringing with it a biting wind that rattled the yellow-tiled roofs and whistled through the high, red-walled corridors. Within these walls, time seemed to move differently, thick and heavy like the incense that drifted from the bronze burners. The air was permeated with the scent of sandalwood and the sharp, metallic tang of charcoal fires. As the Empress Dowager Cixi lay fading in her own quarters, The tension in the air was almost physical, a weight that pressed down upon every eunuch and official. Behind the intricate silk screens of the palace, the silence was not truly silent. It was filled with the soft rustle of silk robes and the hurried, rhythmic padding of cloth-soled shoes on stone. In this world of shadows, every glance carried a meaning, and every whispered word was a potential death sentence. At the center of these shifting currents stood Li Lianying, the grand supervisor of the palace eunuchs. He was a man who had spent more than 50 years navigating the treacherous waters of the Qing court. Known to many as the Lord of the Second Gate, his power was silent but absolute. He was the filter through which all access to the Empress Dowager passed. To the lower eunuchs, he was a figure of immense awe and terror, a man who had survived purges and power struggles that had claimed the lives of countless others. On the morning of November 14th, 1908, Li Lianying was seen moving through the corridors with a purpose that caught the eyes of the observant. While most were focused on the failing health of the Empress Dowager, the head eunuch's attention was directed toward the isolated pavilion where the Guangxu Emperor lived out his days in a gilded cage. The rumors began as ripples in a pond. Court officials, standing in the cold morning air while waiting for audiences, began to exchange hushed observations. It was said that the emperor had been relatively stable, his chronic ailments managed by the imperial physicians. Yet a story began to circulate through the families of the high-ranking ministers, a story of a specific meal. According to these whispers, Li Lianying had been spotted leaving the Empress Dowager's private chambers carrying a simple, decorative bowl. It was filled with yogurt, a common delicacy, but the way he carried it, personally, without the usual retinue of food bearers, struck many as highly unusual. In a palace where every gesture was governed by 1,000 years of ritual, a breach of protocol was often the first sign of a conspiracy. The yogurt was bound for the emperor's breakfast table, a gift, perhaps, or a final gesture of service from the woman who had held him prisoner for 10 years. Think of the scene, the emperor sitting alone in the Yingtai pavilion, surrounded by the cold waters of the South Lake. He was a man of 37 years, once full of dreams for a modern China, now reduced to a ghost inhabiting his own palace. When the bowl was placed before him, there was no reason to suspect the white, cool cream. But within hours of that morning meal, the emperor's quiet isolation was shattered by a sudden, violent agony. Attendants recorded that he began to complain of excruciating stomach pains. His hands, usually steady when he practiced his calligraphy, began to tingle and grow numb. As the poison, white arsenic, tasteless and odorless, began its work, the emperor's physical decline was terrifyingly rapid. Those few eunuchs loyal to him watched in helpless horror as his face, once pale and scholarly, began to darken, taking on a bruised, blue-black tint that no natural illness could explain. The motivation for such a desperate act was rooted in fear, a fear that permeated the very foundations of the court. Rumors had reached the ears of Li Lianying and the powerful General Yuan Shikai that the emperor had kept a secret diary. In its pages, it was whispered, the Guangxu Emperor had written a list of names, those who had betrayed him during the failed reforms of 1898. At the top of that list were the names of those who had ensured his imprisonment. The belief was that if the Empress Dowager passed away and the emperor regained his sovereignty, a tide of executions would follow. For Li Lianying, the death of his mistress was not just a personal loss. It was a looming shadow of the executioner's blade. If the Empress Dowager was to die, the emperor could not be allowed to outlive her by even a single day. As the afternoon light faded on that November day, the physician was finally summoned, but the corridors were blocked by eunuchs acting on orders from the high command. By the time medical help arrived at the pavilion, the emperor was already slipping away. The official records would later state he died of natural exhaustion, but the court knew better. The high-ranking officials who walked those halls after the news broke spoke of a heavy, funereal atmosphere that went beyond the mourning of a monarch. They spoke of a sense of a crime committed in the heart of the sacred city. Decades later, when the world of the Qing Dynasty had fallen into the dust of history, scientists in 2008 would find the physical proof of what the eunuchs had whispered. Arsenic levels 2,000 times higher than normal, concentrated in the very roots of the emperor's hair. The yogurt, the silk screens, and the silent footsteps of Li Lianying were not merely ghosts of the past. They were the architects of a dynasty's final, dark hour. The empire did not end with a bang, but with a long, slow sigh that stretched across the decades. After the year 1908, the vibrant reds and golds of the Forbidden City began to lose their luster, coated by a fine gray veil of neglect. The halls where the Guangxu Emperor once paced, a prisoner of his own title, grew quiet, filled only with the ghosts of unfinished reforms and the lingering scent of sandalwood and old tea. Outside the high walls, the world was changing at a dizzying pace. The ancient structures of power were crumbling, replaced by the chaotic energy of the early Republican era. In 1911, the dynasty finally fell, and the dragon throne became a relic of a vanished age. Yet, even as the political maps were redrawn and the traditional cues of hair were cut in the streets, the mystery of what happened on that cold November day remained lodged like a splinter in the heart of the nation. It was a story told in the shadows of the tea houses, a whisper that refused to die. Yuan Shikai, the man who had once been the emperor's greatest hope and his ultimate betrayer, now stood in the center of the stage. In 1898, he had turned his back on the young sovereign, leading to the emperor's decade of isolation. Now, as the first president of the new republic, Yuan moved through the halls of power with the confidence of a man who had outlived his enemies. Historians and gossips alike looked at his rise with narrow eyes. Was it possible that the man who had effectively ended the emperor's political life had also ended his physical one? The rumors suggested that Yuan, fearing the emperor's return to power should the old Empress Dowager pass away, had found a way to reach through the palace walls. It was said that a bribe, a quiet word to a eunuch, or a small vial of something colorless and odorless was all it took to ensure his own survival. But in those early years of the 20th century, there were no laboratories to test the truth, only the heavy, oppressive weight of suspicion. Within the walls of the palace that had become a gilded cage, the child Emperor Puyi grew up surrounded by the remnants of the old world. He was the last of his line, a boy playing among the ruins of an empire that no longer belonged to him. In his later years, he would write of the stories he heard from the elderly eunuchs who still lingered in the back courtyards. These men, with their wrinkled faces and memories of the old court, spoke of a particular bowl of yogurt sent from the Empress Dowager's kitchen on the day the Guangxu Emperor died. They spoke of the emperor's sudden, violent screams and the way his face had turned a bruised, unnatural shade of blue. To the young Puyi, these were not just historical facts, but family ghost stories, tales of an uncle he never knew, who had been swallowed by the very system he tried to change. The memoirs of these survivors became the primary evidence for decades, keeping the flame of the poisoning theory alive through the fires of revolution and world war. While the world above ground was torn apart by conflict and change, the Guangxu Emperor lay in the deep silence of the western Qing tombs. His final resting place, the Chongqing Mausoleum, was not completed until 1913, well after his dynasty had ceased to exist. It was a place of profound stillness, where the wind whistled through the cypress trees and the stone guardians stood watch over a secret buried in the earth. For nearly a century, the emperor's remains stayed undisturbed, tucked away in a chamber of cold marble. The dust of decades settled over the silk robes and the jade ornaments, while historians in the outside world argued over medical records and palace diaries. Some claimed he had died of tuberculosis or a broken heart, or the natural failure of a fragile constitution. They pointed to the official records which spoke of long-standing illnesses. But those who knew the history of the court knew that records could be forged as easily as a signature, and that in the Forbidden City, truth was often the first thing to be buried. The turning point came exactly 100 years after the emperor's breath had left his body. In the early 21st century, a team of researchers and scientists set out to solve the cold case once and for all. This was not a task for historians alone, but for forensic experts and nuclear physicists. They gathered in the quiet of the tomb. Their white laboratory coats a stark contrast to the ancient, crumbling silks of the imperial burial. Using modern technology that would have seemed like magic to the court of 1908, they took samples of the emperor's hair, his bones, and the clothing that had been in contact with his skin for a century. The process was slow and meticulous, requiring 5 years of careful study. They were looking for something specific, a shadow left behind by a killer who thought they had escaped justice through the passage of time. They worked with the China Institute of Atomic Energy, using neutron activation analysis to peer into the very atoms of the emperor's remains. The results, when they were finally released in 2008, sent a shockwave through the halls of history. The hair of the Guangxu Emperor did not just contain arsenic, it was saturated with it. The levels were over 2,000 times higher than what would be considered normal. Most tellingly, the concentration was highest at the roots and in the clothing near the stomach, proving that this was not the result of long-term exposure to traditional medicines. It was a single, massive, lethal dose administered in his final hours. The evidence was undeniable. A century of speculation had been transformed into scientific fact. The emperor had been murdered. As the researchers packed away their equipment and the heavy doors of the tomb were closed once more, the dust finally began to settle in a different way. The mystery of the killer's identity still lingered. Was it the empress, the general, or the eunuch? But the voice of the emperor had finally been heard. After 100 years of silence, the truth had emerged from the shadows of the past, as cold and clear as the arsenic that had taken his life. The year 2003 brought a renewed silence to the Western Qing tombs, a quiet that was profoundly different from the heavy, stagnant air of the decades prior. It was a silence of deep anticipation. The Chongqing Mausoleum, where the Guangxu Emperor had been laid to rest, stood as a lonely sentinel under the wide, pale sky of the Hebei province. This site, located far from the bustling, neon-lit noise of modern Beijing, served as the final sanctuary for an emperor who had lived much of his life as a prisoner within his own walls. But in 2003, the seal was metaphorically broken once more. This time, it was not by looters seeking gold or jewels, but by men and women in white coats seeking the ultimate historical truth through the lens of modern science. When the researchers first stepped into the underground palace, they were greeted by the cool, unchanging breath of the deep earth. The atmosphere inside the stone chambers was thick, carrying the heavy scent of ancient dust and the faint, mineral tang of damp limestone. In the dim, flickering light of their portable lamps, the tomb revealed its somber and clinical beauty. This was a place meticulously designed for an eternity of rest, yet it had been touched by the unforgiving hands of time and the harsh violence of past intrusions. As they approached the area where the remains of the emperor were kept, the air seemed to grow heavier and thicker, as if the weight of the entire Qing Dynasty was pressing down upon their shoulders in the dark. The focus of their delicate work centered on what remained of the man himself. Remarkably, despite the passage of nearly 100 years, certain elements of the emperor had been preserved with a startling, almost haunting clarity. Most striking of all was his hair. To look upon the hair of the Guangxu Emperor was to bridge the gap between the distant past and the immediate present. It was dark, fine, and quite long, appearing almost as though it had been groomed and braided only a few years prior rather than a full century ago. It lay there in the quiet dark, tangled with the brittle fragments of his burial garments, acting as a silent witness to his final, agonizing hours. Each strand was more than just tissue. It was a biological record, a microscopic diary that had captured the chemical signatures of his very last breaths. The researchers moved with a quiet, practiced reverence that bordered on the sacred. Using fine brushes and wooden tools, they began the arduous process of examining the emperor's clothing. The silk robes, which had once been vibrant with the primary colors of the imperial court, were now fragile and muted, turned to shades of gray and ochre. They felt like the translucent wings of a moth, thin, brittle, and ready to crumble into nothingness at the slightest miscalculation of force or movement. These were the very garments that had covered his frail frame as he lay dying on his lonely bed in the Forbidden City, surrounded by enemies and silence. As the scientists meticulously inspected the layers of fabric, they noticed something incredibly peculiar about the area around the stomach. The silk in that specific region was different. It was significantly darkened and appeared corroded, as if by some internal chemical fire. This corrosion was not the typical wear one would expect from a century of time. It was a localized, intense destruction of the fabric, a physical sign that something within the emperor's body had reacted violently with his environment after his heart had stopped beating. The texture of the silk in this region was stiff and deeply discolored, providing a stark and jarring contrast to the better-preserved sections near his shoulders or his feet. To the trained and cynical eyes of the forensic experts, this was the first tangible physical clue that something abnormal had occurred. It was as if the body itself had tried to speak through the very clothes it wore, leaving a dark, permanent stain that refused to fade into history. The researchers gathered their samples with painstaking care. A few precious, dark strands of hair and several small, brittle fragments of the silk from the stomach area, and placed them into sterile, modern containers. The entire process was slow, a long meditation on the fragility of human life and the enduring power of scientific evidence. In that underground chamber, the transition from an imperial myth to a rigorous scientific investigation was finally complete. They were no longer just looking at the remains of a fallen monarch. They were looking at the evidence of a possible crime scene. Every speck of ancient dust and every fiber of yellowing silk was a potential piece of a grand, tragic puzzle that had remained unsolved for far too long. As they finally stepped back out into the blinding light of the day, leaving the emperor to return to the shadows of the Chongqing, they carried with them the physical keys to a mystery that had haunted the Chinese consciousness for over 100 years. The hair and the clothing were far more than just relics. They were the messengers of a truth that had been buried deep. In the months that followed, these samples would travel to high-tech laboratories where massive machines would peer into their molecular structure, searching for the unmistakable shadow of the poison that had stolen a life and forever changed the course of a nation. The seal had been broken, and the truth was finally ready to be whispered into the world, strand by strand. The team moved from the gray, weathered stones of the western Qing tombs into a world of stark white tiles, and the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of high-technology machinery. They arrived at the China Institute of Atomic Energy, carrying the fragile remnants of an emperor in sterile, climate-controlled containers. Here, the air was filtered and stripped of the scent of earth and decay, replaced by the cool, ozone-tinged stillness of a modern laboratory. It was an intersection of eras that felt almost surreal. In these rooms, physicists and forensic experts from the Beijing Municipal Public Security Bureau stood ready to interrogate the past using tools that would have seemed like sorcery to the court of the late Qing Dynasty. They were no longer looking for silk scrolls or hidden letters. They were looking for the silent, elemental signatures trapped within the very fabric of the emperor's body. At the center of this scientific investigation lay a single, remarkable artifact, a strand of the emperor's hair, measuring 10 inches in length. To the naked eye, it was merely a dark, brittle thread, a ghostly piece of a man who had been dead for exactly 100 years. Beside it lay fragments of silk, the remnants of the imperial robes that had once draped over his stomach, now stained and degraded by the chemistry of time. The scientists handled these items with a terrifying level of precision, using specialized tweezers and vacuum-sealed containers to ensure that not a single speck of modern dust could contaminate the ancient samples. They were searching for a ghost in the machine, a whisper of a specific chemical that had been rumored to have ended a life in the final days of 1908. The method they chose for this task was as sophisticated as it was revealing: neutron activation analysis. Inside the heart of a nuclear research reactor, the samples were bombarded with a steady, invisible stream of neutrons. This process, though hidden from the human eye, caused the various elements within the hair and silk to become momentarily radioactive. As these elements began to decay, they emitted unique patterns of gamma rays, a chemical fingerprint that could be read with absolute mathematical certainty. It was a slow, methodical interrogation. For hours, the samples sat in the cold, blue-tinted environment of the facility, the atoms themselves being prodded to reveal the secrets they had held since the final, agonizing hours of the Guangxu Emperor's life, spent in isolation at the pavilion. When the data finally flickered across the monitors in the quiet observation room, the results were staggering. In a healthy human being, arsenic is present only in the tiniest, most negligible amounts, often from simple contact with the environment. But in the hair of the emperor, the levels were 2,400 times higher than the normal limit. The concentration was so extreme that it bypassed any possibility of environmental contamination or the slow, accidental buildup of medicinal toxins. The forensic team calculated that the amount of arsenic trioxide found within the remains was more than triple the dose required to kill a grown man. The silk from the stomach area was equally telling, saturated with the poison as the body had succumbed and decayed, leaking the lethal substance into the very clothes he was buried in a century ago. To be absolutely certain, this was not the result of long-term exposure from the traditional medicines of the era, which sometimes contained trace metals. The scientists performed a meticulous sectional analysis. They divided the 10-inch strand of hair into tiny, microscopic segments, measuring the poison levels from the root all the way to the tip. In cases of chronic, slow-acting poisoning, the arsenic is usually distributed more heavily toward the ends of the hair as it grows over time. But here, the pattern was completely reversed. The highest concentrations were found at the roots, closest to the scalp. This was the definitive evidence of an acute event, a massive, singular administration of poison that had occurred shortly before his heart stopped beating on that November evening. The science had finally caught up with the rumors, transforming a century of suspicion into an undeniable forensic fact. As the final reports were compiled in the year 2008, a heavy silence settled over the research team. They had provided the what and the how with surgical precision. The emperor had not died of tuberculosis or a broken heart, as the official Qing records had claimed for 10 decades. He had been murdered. But as the scientists turned off their monitors and the reactor's hum faded into the background, a different kind of shadow began to stretch across the laboratory. While the isotopes had given them the truth of the poison, they could not name the hand that held the cup. The strands of evidence had led them to a crime scene, but now the narrative had to return to the dark, winding halls of the Forbidden City, where the list of suspects remained as long and as intricate as the history of the dynasty itself. The year was 2008, exactly 100 years after the young emperor had breathed his last in the secluded pavilion. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit rooms of the China Institute of Atomic Energy and the forensic laboratories of the Beijing Municipal Public Security Bureau, a 5-year investigation was reaching its crescendo. For a century, the cause of death for the Guangxu Emperor had been a whisper, a rumor, and a point of academic debate. But as the researchers leaned over their equipment, the fog of history began to lift, replaced by the cold, hard data of modern science. They were no longer looking for poetic metaphors or hidden diaries. They were looking for molecules. The air in the lab was thick with anticipation as the final samples were processed. These were not mere artifacts, but fragments of a human life, strands of hair, pieces of bone, and the very silk that had once rested against the emperor's skin during his final, agonizing hours. The focus of the study was a meticulous analysis of the emperor's hair. Using a technique known as neutron activation analysis, the scientists could peer into the chemical history of the man. If the emperor had been poisoned slowly over time, the arsenic would be distributed evenly or concentrated at the ends of the hair follicles as the body tried to purge the toxin. But the results showed something far more sinister. The arsenic was concentrated in specific, massive spikes. This was not the work of a slow-acting environmental hazard or the byproduct of traditional medicines taken over months. This was the signature of an acute, massive event. The distribution of the poison suggested that a single, overwhelming dose had been administered shortly before his death. The data points on the screen formed a jagged peak, a visual representation of a lethal moment that had been hidden for 10 decades. When the final numbers were calculated, the room must have fallen into a stunned silence. The level of arsenic in the emperor's remains was found to be 2,000 times higher than that of an ordinary person. To put that into perspective, the concentration was more than triple the amount required to be immediately fatal to a healthy adult. It was not just a poisoning, it was an execution by chemistry. The sheer volume of arsenic trioxide, a substance known in historical circles as the king of poisons, was staggering. This white, odorless, and tasteless powder would have been easily dissolved in a bowl of soup or a cup of medicinal tea, leaving the victim entirely unaware until the first wave of fire began to burn in their stomach. The quantity found suggested that whoever had prepared the dose wanted to be absolutely certain that the emperor would not survive the night. The evidence extended beyond the hair and bones to the very clothes the emperor had been buried in. On the inner layers of the silk garments, particularly around the region of the stomach and the lower back, the researchers found massive stains of arsenic. These were not surface contaminants from the soil of the tomb. Instead, they were the results of the body's own decay. As the emperor's internal organs broke down over the century, the poison that had settled in his digestive tract leaked outward, saturating the fabric of his imperial robes. The concentration in these garments was even higher than in the hair, providing a map of the poison's final resting place within his body. The silk, once a symbol of his high status, had become a canvas that preserved the evidence of his murder, holding the toxic secret in its fibers for 100 years. To ensure their findings were beyond reproach, the team compared these results with samples taken from the surrounding environment of the Western Qing tombs. They tested the soil, the water, and even samples from other members of the royal family buried nearby. None of the other remains showed these astronomical levels of toxicity. The soil was clean. The environmental theory was officially dead. The revelation in 2008 changed everything. It transformed the story of the Guangxu Emperor from one of a tragic, sickly man who died of natural causes into a high-stakes crime scene. The scientific certainty of the arsenic levels meant that historians could no longer ignore the political implications. If he was poisoned with such a massive, professional dose, then the question was no longer how he died, but who had the power and the motive to ensure he never walked out of his prison alive. The report concluded that the emperor had suffered the symptoms described in the secret diaries of his physicians: the blue face, the violent abdominal pains, and the sudden, sharp decline in his already fragile health. These were the classic, textbook hallmarks of arsenic trioxide poisoning. As the researchers published their findings in November of 2008, the image of the emperor changed. We no longer see just a captive monarch looking out over the water of the South Ocean. We see a man in his final hours, his body reeling from a toxicity 2,000 times greater than normal, his life ending in a quiet, calculated act of violence. The science had spoken, and the echo of its verdict was a cold, metallic ring that sounded through the halls of history, demanding we look closer at those who stood in the shadows of his sickbed. The palace is a place where silence has its own weight. It is not merely the absence of sound, but a heavy, velvet pressure that settles over the red walls and the golden tiles of the Forbidden City. We have looked at the chemical evidence, the stark reality of the arsenic found in the hair and the bones nearly 100 years later, but science only tells us the what. It does not tell us the who, or more importantly, the why. To find the architect of this end, we must step back into the final, shivering days of November, 1908. Imagine the air, cold enough to bite, smelling of coal smoke and the ancient, stagnant water of the moats. Inside the pavilion of cherishing elegance, the emperor lay dying, his body a battlefield of fire and ice. But just a short distance away, another life was flickering out. The Empress Dowager Cixi, the woman who had held China in her iron grip for almost half a century, was also reaching her end. The timing is too perfect, too synchronized to be a mere trick of fate. It suggests a hand moving the pieces on a board, ensuring that when the light went out for the old Buddha, as she was known, it would go out for her nephew as well. Cixi is the most prominent figure in this dark tapestry. By 1908, she was 74 years old, an incredible age for that era, and she had spent every moment of her adult life protecting her power. She had survived coups, foreign invasions, and the rise and fall of multiple emperors. But as her own body began to fail her, a terrifying thought must have taken root in her mind. If she died and the Guangxu Emperor remained alive, he would finally be free. The man she had kept under house arrest for 10 years, the man whose spirit she had tried to break, would regain his throne. He would be the absolute ruler of China. And Cixi knew her nephew well. She knew he was a reformer at heart, a man who wanted to sweep away the old world she had spent her life preserving. She feared that the moment she was gone, he would reverse every decree, dismantle her legacy, and perhaps most frighteningly, he would take his revenge on those she loved and those who had served her. In the whisper-thin logic of a dying tyrant, it was perhaps better to destroy the future than to let it undo the past. Think of the atmosphere in those final hours. The silk robes rustling against stone floors, the soft clicking of prayer beads, and the constant, rhythmic chanting of monks in the distance. Cixi was a woman of ritual and order. She understood the machinery of the palace better than anyone. If she gave the order, it would be carried out with the same quiet efficiency as the morning tea. There are accounts from those days, rumors that drifted through the courtyards, suggesting she had openly declared that she could not die and leave the emperor to survive her. This was not a secret of the heart, it was a political necessity. She had already chosen the next successor, the tiny child Puyi, who was only 2 years old. By removing Guangxu and placing a toddler on the throne, the power would remain with the next generation of her chosen regents. The emperor's death was the final lock on the door she had built around her dynasty. But as we peel back the layers of the palace, another face emerges from the shadows. A man whose very survival depended on the emperor's demise. Yuan Shikai. To understand Yuan, we must look back to 1898, to the 100 Days of Reform. Back then, the young emperor had trusted Yuan, a powerful general, to help him overthrow the conservatives and Cixi herself. It was a gamble for the soul of the nation. But Yuan Shikai was a man of cold calculation. He saw which way the wind was blowing, and he chose the Empress Dowager. He betrayed the emperor, leading to Guangxu's lifelong imprisonment. For 10 years, Yuan Shikai lived with the knowledge that if the emperor ever regained power, the first person to face the executioner's blade would be himself. The emperor had even written in his secret diaries that he intended to have Yuan Shikai executed as soon as he was free. For Yuan, the emperor's survival was a literal death sentence. He had the means, the military connections, and the access to palace eunuchs who could be bribed or coerced. He was a man who moved in the gray spaces between the old world and the new, and a small dose of arsenic would have been a simple solution to a very large problem. The texture of this conspiracy is smooth, almost invisible. In the Forbidden City, poison was not a weapon of the desperate, it was a tool of the precise. We must also consider the chief eunuch, Li Lianying. He was Cixi's most trusted confidant, a man who had lived his entire life in the shadow of the throne. Like Yuan Shikai, he was hated by the emperor. There were stories that the emperor had specifically marked Li for death. If Cixi was the architect, Li Lianying was the builder. He controlled the flow of food, the medicine, and the information that reached the emperor's bedside. It would have been so easy. A bit of powder stirred into a bowl of yogurt, or a dose of medicine that promised relief, but delivered only agony. In the hush of the night, with the wind whistling through the lattices and the incense smoke swirling in the dim light, the deed would be done before anyone could even suspect a crime had been committed. We are left weighing the motives of a dying empress against the fears of a rising general. Cixi had the authority, Yuan Shikai had the urgency. Both stood to lose everything if Guangxu lived to see the sunrise of November 16th. The emperor was a prisoner of his own bloodline, caught between a woman who saw him as a failed son and a general who saw him as a ghost from a past he wanted to bury. As we listen to the soft rain or the quiet of our own rooms, we can almost hear the echoes of those final, labored breaths in the summer palace. The emperor died on the 14th, and Cixi followed on the 15th. The timing is a confession in itself. Whether it was the order of a woman who refused to let go of the world, or the desperate act of a man who feared the world would take its revenge, the result was the same. The reform was over. The emperor was gone. And the architect, whoever they were, succeeded in closing the book on an empire that was already crumbling into the dust of history. The moon hangs low over the yellow-tiled roofs of the Forbidden City, casting long, ink-black shadows across the stone courtyards. We find ourselves at the Ocean Terrace, a lonely island of pavilions surrounded by the dark, still waters of the lake. It is the evening of November 14, 1908. Inside the Hanyuan Temple, the air is thick with the scent of medicinal herbs and the low, flickering light of tallow candles. The Emperor Guangxu, only 37 years old, lies in a bed of heavy silks, his breathing shallow and labored. For 10 long years, this island has been his gilded cage, a place where his dreams of a modern, reformed China went to wither under the watchful eye of his aunt, the Empress Dowager Cixi. But tonight, the isolation feels different. It feels final. The silence of the lake is no longer just a barrier, it is a shroud. The historical records of that night describe a scene of agonizing physical distress. Imperial physicians noted that the emperor suffered from sudden, violent spasms in his stomach. His face, usually pale and refined, reportedly turned a haunting shade of blue as he curled in pain. These were not the slow, rhythmic ebbs of a chronic illness, but the sharp, jagged edges of something much more sinister. For a century, the official story whispered by the palace was that he died of natural causes, perhaps a broken heart or a failing constitution. But those who stood in the shadows of the Forbidden City knew better. They watched as the Empress Dowager Cixi, 74 years old and facing her own end, prepared for the transition of power. She would pass away only 22 hours after him. The timing was too perfect, the coincidence too sharp to be anything but a calculated act of statecraft. For 100 years, the truth remained buried beneath the earth of the Western Qing tombs. It was a ghost story told in hushed tones until the year 2008. That year, A team of forensic scientists and historians in Beijing decided to let the modern world speak to the ancient one. They approached the remains of the emperor with the cold, sterile precision of the 21st century. Using advanced technology, they examined a single strand of the emperor's hair, measuring only 10 inches long. What they found was a chemical signature that shattered a century of silence. The hair contained levels of arsenic that were 2,400 times higher than those found in an ordinary person. This was not the result of environmental exposure or the trace amounts sometimes found in traditional medicines of the time. This was a lethal, concentrated dose of arsenic trioxide, known to many as white arsenic. The evidence was undeniable. It was found not just in his hair, but in the very fabric of his burial clothes, concentrated around the region of his stomach, where the poison had settled and corroded the silk over decades of decay. Science had finally given the ghost of the Forbidden City a voice. As we look back at the tragedy of Guangxu, we see a man who was a visionary ahead of his time. His 100 days of reform in 1898 could have steered the Qing Dynasty toward a peaceful, constitutional future. He wanted to build schools, modernize the military, and embrace the changing world. But those dreams were poisoned long before he was. They were poisoned by the fear of the old guard and the iron will of Cixi, who could not bear to see her power slip away, even as she felt the cold touch of death approaching her own bed. Whether it was Cixi herself, who ordered the final cup of yogurt laced with toxin, or the ambitious General Yuan Shikai, who feared the emperor's retribution, the result was the same. A reformer was silenced, and with him, the last hope for an empire. The echoes of his footsteps on the ocean terrace remind us that history is often written in the dark, but it cannot stay hidden forever. The truth has a way of rising to the surface, like a bubble in a quiet lake. The tragedy of the Guangxu Emperor is a story of a man caught between two worlds, a man whose life was a series of walls until the very end. But now, the mystery is resolved. The science is settled. The spirit of the emperor can finally find the peace that the Forbidden City never allowed him in life. As the light fades from the yellow tiles and the waters of the Zhongnanhai Lake settle into a glass-like calm, we leave the shadows of the Qing Dynasty behind. The stories of the past are heavy, but you do not have to carry them anymore. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.